Pigmentation of the Ancient Egyptians. Test by Melanin. By Professor Cheikh Anta Diop. A. General considerations. The following development aims to show 1. That the melanin level is a fundamental racial characteristic. 2. That this level can be very well measured in practice by various laboratory methods for all races and for living or dead beings. We then applied the method to some Egyptian mummies preserved in the anthropology laboratory of the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, thanks to the kindness of Mrs. Chamla, head of the department, and her assistants. We used the technique of thin sections observed under ultraviolet or natural light. The preparations were graciously mounted by Mrs. J. Guyen, technician at the Physiology Laboratory of the Faculty of Sciences of Dakar, and Mr. Mamadou Cissé, head of the Vertebrate Department of IFAN. The results are eloquent. One can first notice that, contrary to a very widespread opinion, the mummification processes do not destroy the epidermis to the point of making the method inapplicable in most cases. In particular, it would certainly allow the analysis of the skin of all the royal mummies of the Cairo Museum in perfect condition. Thutmose III, founder of the 18th dynasty, the conqueror of all Western Asia, Seti I, founder of the 19th dynasty, his son, the famous Ramses II, etc. The game would be worth the candle, and that is why I tried to obtain samples to analyze. The curator of the Cairo Museum, Dr. Ryad, had promised to send me some, but I have been waiting for over a year. I am surprised that such an analysis has not already been attempted and carried out by other researchers long ago. In any case, we can affirm that such an examination undoubtedly reveals a melanin level unknown in leucodermic races, and indubitably classifies the ancient Egyptians among the Africans of Black Africa. Let's make a few general remarks before addressing the technical explanation of the method. First, note that even current Egyptians, after so many millennia of interbreeding, still mostly belong to the B blood group of the Negroes of West Africa, excluding the A2 group, except for the current inhabitants of the Delta region, who have evidently come from elsewhere. Since the blood groups of the last prehistoric men can in some cases be determined from their skeletons and mummy remains, there is a possibility for studying migrations. The A2 blood group is of considerable anthropological importance. It is characteristic of whites of European origin, and is not generally found in people of color, particularly Negroes. Gloger's rule establishes that in higher animals with warm blood, melanic pigmentation tends to increase with heat and humidity. A high degree of humidity combined with a high degree of heat causes black pigmentation. The maximum pigmentation is found in the hot regions of the equator, and the minimum in the Arctic Circle. The same scale seems to be valid for humans. Moreover, the triumph of the thesis of the monogenetic origin of humanity compels us to reconsider all ethnic problems from a new angle. Drawing all the consequences of this fact, we must admit that all other races are derived from the black race, perhaps starting from a differentiation of the Grimaldi man in Europe. Current laws of heredity do not oppose this. Quantum chemistry even attempts to formulate the law of biological mutations, or at least to provide a satisfactory scientific explanation for it. The Grimaldi would have passed through Gibraltar in Spain, as the Apulian man would have done. Another parallel path, quite probable, would pass through Tunisia, Sicily, and southern Italy. A humanity born under the latitude of the Great Lakes must, according to what follows about the functional role of pigmentation and according to Gloger's rule, be pigmented and black. If this hypothesis is to be considered, and it is hard to see how, in the current state of scientific research, it could be avoided, the picture of human species evolution would be as follows. A heavily pigmented Homo sapiens negroid, Gloger's law, would have left the Great Lakes region, Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, to populate the rest of the world through migration. According to Dr. Leakey, not only Homo faber but also Homo sapiens was also born in Black Africa, at least 150,000 years ago. We think that this man would have reached Europe not through the Isthmus of Suez and the periphery of the eastern Mediterranean, where his traces are non-existent, but through the Sahara, Spain, or Italy. which gives particular importance to the cave paintings marking this route and, it must be said, raises chronology problems. But these are in the process of finding a scientific solution. In fact, they are the result of a sort of curse that the eminent French scientist Vaufry inadvertently cast on Africa. "Africa is trailing behind," he wrote. "From then on, it became sacrilege to attribute an ancient age to anything in Black Africa. Nothing here should be chronologically related to anything in Europe. But here is the advent of absolute chronology, potassium, argon, C14, etc., that restores the rights of science against the prejudices of scientists, hence the triumph of the monogenetic origin of man, with the location of humanity's cradle in Africa. It is the potassium-argon method and related ones that have made this achievement possible. It is even known that men, probably of the sapiens species, exploited the world's oldest mine 40,000 years ago in Swaziland to extract red ochre. But leaving this latter case aside to return to that of the Homo sapiens of Kenya, their antiquity, they are earlier than Grimaldi and the man of Combe Capelle, makes plausible the idea of a migration to Europe of Homo sapiens negroids, the Grimaldian in this case, in the Upper Paleolithic. African prehistoric facts could very well explain those of Spain and southern France, free of prejudice. Two difficulties would remain. 1. Saharan chronology should one day provide dates attributable to the Upper Paleolithic, and not only to the Neolithic for what concerns rock art in particular. One can assume that a finer, deeper, and more methodical study of the facts could also change our ideas on this serious question. 2. The difficulty the prehistoric man would have in crossing the Strait of Gibraltar. At the 7th Congress of Prehistory, Addis Ababa, 1971, typologist M. Tixier spoke of the irritation of Lower Paleolithic specialists whenever they consider the implications of the presence of hand axes, this typically African industry, in southern Europe to the exclusion of northern regions. In fact, the idea that imposes itself is that from this distant time of the Lower Paleolithic, Homo faber, the Apulian man, was already sufficiently equipped to cross the Strait of Gibraltar. All the more reason the Grimaldi man of the Upper Paleolithic could have performed such a feat. If this was the path followed, how can we explain racial differentiation, in this case the appearance of the white or Cro-Magnon man 20,000 years ago in the Solutrean, i.e., 10,000 years after the arrival of the Grimaldi Negroid in Europe? The problem is posed. Science will answer it, but the filiation imposes itself scientifically on our minds, with the triumph of the monogenetic thesis. One will find in the report we made of the colloquium on the appearance of Homo sapiens the ideas that could be cautiously advanced on this question, regarding the probability of mutations with the change of environment. Let us not forget that the Grimaldi, who in any case is a Negroid invader, is the earliest occupant in date of the European soil as Homo sapiens sapiens, and that the first white appeared 10,000 years after his arrival. One can suppose a mutation due to the change of physical conditions, particularly climatic, because we are in the full glacial period, and Negroes or Negroids transplanted in such conditions for such a period could well change in appearance. The distinctly Negroid characteristics of the men of Cro-Magnon from Spain, the nigritic osteology of the first men of Cro-Magnon from France, the late appearance of this white, the even later appearance of the yellow, the man of Chancelade in the Magdalenian 15,000 years ago, so many facts that did not receive a rational explanation become more intelligible in the light of this hypothesis. Western scientists have already expressed similar ideas. This is the case of Sanforsh quoting Guri. Moreover, the works of art of the Paleolithic clearly situate the pinnacle of the civilization of that distant time in Western Europe, more specifically in the Aquitaine-Cantabrian region, manifested from the Aurignacian as one of the first creations of Homo sapiens. Art developed in the Solutrean to flourish magnificently in the Magdalenian. During this long period, it is still the West that is the initiator, or at least the transmitter of a civilization perhaps coming from the south, that is, from northwestern Africa. Here is what Professor Gori thinks about it. A civilization originating from African soil, that would shake the principles taught so far. The classical tradition has never ceased to assert that all ancient civilizations come from the East. We are so impregnated with traditions erected into dogmas that an Africa as a civilizing nucleus seems incomprehensible to us. What we can affirm is that the first current of people to whom we owe our lower Aurigation comes from Africa through Spain, and undoubtedly also through Italy. Be that as it may, we see that the time is not far off when the scholarly world will admit that the black race is the first Homo sapiens race to exist. All others are derived from it through a process that science will specify. It is therefore no longer necessary to populate Black Africa and Egypt at the dawn of time by mysterious whites or non-Negro races. B. Technical part. In the current state of research, the authors, R. A. Nicholas, distinguish three types of melanin. 1. Eumelanin or true melanin black. 2. Pheomelanin or yellow-brown melanin. 3. Allomelanin or other melanins made up of pigments that vary from brown to yellow. The first two types are mostly found in the animal kingdom, while the last one predominates in the plant kingdom. Eumelanin is responsible for the color of the skin and hair. Tyrosine is the precursor of eumelanins. Black pigments are generally formed from the oxidation of diphenols, such as dihydroxyphenylalanine, DIOPA, 5,6-dihydroxyindole, catechol, and 1,8-dihydroxynaphthalene, where quinone nuclei with many active centers for polymerization are formed. This is a necessary condition to obtain a black pigment. Compounds in which the number of active centers is limited produce brown, reddish-brown, yellow-brown pigments. The relative insolubility of melanins makes their study delicate as it becomes difficult to purify them. However, they are remarkably stable, and melanin has been found on fossil specimens dating back 150 million years. They can be heated to 600 degrees Celsius without decomposition. According to R. A. Nicholas, modern physicochemical analysis methods are not usable for the study of melanin structure. Indeed, they absorb both in the ultraviolet and the visible violet, without a characteristic band. Nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy is very difficult. The infrared spectrum is of no interest, and the X-ray diffraction spectrum has just shown that the structure is not crystalline. Electron spin resonance spectroscopy revealed the free radical property of melanins. The study of degradation products has yielded interesting results. The tracer method, which consists of labeling with C14, for example, a precursor like tyrosine, is full of promises. It is already allowed following the formation of melanin in hair, etc. Among the different pigments that contribute to the formation of skin color, carotene, oxyhemoglobin, reduced hemoglobin, melanin, this last one plays the role of the main racial factor in the pigmentation of the skin of different races. Special cells called melanocytes are responsible for the formation of melanin in the dermis, and especially in the human epidermis. Their number is relatively independent of the race, but their activity, that is, the amount of melanin they can produce, depends on a racial factor linked to the genetic code. In other words, the Negro has the same number of melanocytes as the white and the albino for a given region of the skin, but his cells being much more active will produce more melanin grains than those of the white because of the activity of tyrosinase, the enzyme that controls the formation of melanin. Melanocytes are found in the Malpighian layer of the epidermis, 1035 per millimeter in Negroes. It seems that there is no qualitative difference in melanin when passing from one race to another, but only variations in quantity. The elaboration of melanin generally requires three elements: the substrate, tyrosine or DOPA, the enzyme catalyst of the oxidation reaction of the substrate, and oxygen. The reaction depends on several factors: temperature, pH, redox potential, and the presence of enzyme inhibitors, such as sulfhydryl functional groups. Biochemical substances inhibiting tyrosinase all contain the functional group, NC, and are powerful reducing agents. There is nevertheless a correlation between the size and morphology of melanocytes and their activity. The support protein of albino tyrosinoids is genetically defective. The gene responsible for albinism acts through reducing groups. It has been thought that the oxidation of 5,6-dihydroxyindole can be inhibited in albino animals by sulfhydryl functional groups that are present in melanitic melanocytes. Alpha MSH, melanin-stimulating hormone, beta MSH, and ACTH, adrenocorticotropin hormone, stimulate the differentiation of unpigmented melanoblast cells into pigmented melanocytes. Tyrosinase activity is favored by the hormonal secretion of the pituitary gland. The electron spin resonance, ESR, detected in natural melanins is attributed to the existence of free radicals trapped in the polymerized mass of macromolecules. The paramagnetism of melanins would thus be explained. Being electron exchangers, melanins could have a protective role for the organism against redox phenomena and the trapping of free radicals that could disturb the metabolism of living cells. They could protect the skin against radiation through such a mechanism. Melanins are probably a mixture of macromolecules formed by the copolymerization of different precursors. Hydrogen peroxide decolors eumelanin. Melanin is purified by 1. Washing with 1% HCl, 2. Hot extraction with acetone, 3. Prolonged boiling in concentrated HCl. According to studies conducted with the electron microscope, 2 types of epidermal cells are responsible for skin pigmentation, the melanocyte and the Malpighian cell. The dendritic melanocyte manufactures melanin and distributes it to neighboring Malpighian cells, P. Druchmann's P155-156. Melanocytes contain tyrosinase, an enzyme that transforms tyrosine and more rapidly DOPA into melanin. This is dispersed in the form of grains in the cell and in its dendritic extensions. Melanocytes have an epidermal location, and those whose pekarion entirely dives into the dermis are separated from it by the dermal membrane. The thus pigmented Malpighian cells carry the pigmentation during their evolution towards the surface of the epidermis. Method of quantitative determination. The measurement of skin color by spectrophotometry was carried out in America as early as 1939 on whites, Japanese, Indians, mulattoes, and Negroes, on the skins of cadavers, and the results were conclusive. The sum of the absorptions, transmissions, and reflections of the different layers of the skin is a characteristic of it. 5 pigments and a dispersion factor play an important role. To the 4 already cited must be added melanoid. A piece of Negro skin, 25 square inches, is macerated in 5% KOH, melanin being soluble in diluted alkalis. The resulting solution is dosed by spectrophotometry. The analysis reveals a high absorption, without characteristic band, however, at the beginning of the visible spectrum in the violet, and a minimum absorption at the end of the spectrum in the red. The transmission increases without interruption from violet to red. Melanin, like other pigments, obeys Beer's law, that is, the logarithm of the transmission is directly proportional to the concentration. The idea that racial differences in color are solely due to variations in the quantity of melanin in the epidermis has been confirmed by observations made on dissolved melanin. Melanin behaves equivalently under the skin and in solution. The spectrophotometric properties of melanin, among others, absorption band in the visible violet, classify melanoid as a degradation product of melanin. Women are generally less pigmented than men of the same race. The amount of melanoid formed always depends on the amount of melanin present, and storage depends on the thickness of the epidermal skin. The 2 varieties of blood hemoglobins have characteristic absorption bands and transmission peaks. Light is reflected by the epidermis, dermis, and vein walls. Carotene has an absorption band in the blue at 482 mu. By dissolution and spectrophotometric analysis, it has been determined that the color of fats is due to carotene. It is also present in the thick parts of the epidermis. All pigments have predominant absorption in the blue. The transmitted light contains a greater proportion of long wavelengths, red, while the reflected light contains short wavelengths, blue. This is a dispersion effect. Racial differences are explained by the quantities of melanin and melanoid to the exclusion of other pigments, carotene, hemoglobin. Ross Aiken-Gortner studied the effect of alkalis on melanin and described the conditions for good extraction without decomposition with soda at 0.2%. The melanin obtained is then soluble in acetic, formic, or mineral acids of less than N10 concentration. Otherwise, losses easily reach 50%. Melanin decomposes as soon as the concentration of the alkali exceeds 0.2%, according to this author, who remarks, "One can obtain a black product from black wool by any method. If the pigment is well prepared, combustion leaves no ashes, and one can then determine the rates of HCNSO, according to classical analysis methods, combustion in an oxygen stream, Dumas method for nitrogen, etc. A.J. Leah reports the solubility of all varieties of melanin in cold ethylene chlorhydrin. It seems that it is not a combination with the so-called solvent, as is the case with diethylamine, because the residual product after evaporation retains all the properties of melanin. One can obtain a good resolution of melanin grains by microscopic observation in ultraviolet light by making thin sections fixed with glutaraldehyde and post-fixed with osmium tetroxide. Vilter notes that the larvae of the axolotl mexicanum change color depending on the light conditions or the color of the background on which they develop. This chromatic adaptation phenomenon is controlled by the nervous system through vision. The larvae stay on a black background, gradually darkens the skin tone. The melanophores of the segmental melanic spots of young larvae spread considerably, determining the more intense color and the gradual merging of these spots. Axolotls kept on a white background present a skin coloration that gradually lightens in young larvae. The segmental spots gradually decrease in extent and intensity due to the contraction of the melanophores. If the stay on a white background is prolonged, the melanic pattern is soon represented only by small, round, grayish spots, clearly isolated from each other. An Austro-American group of researchers recently asserted that skin color particularly depends on the regular distribution of melanosomes, a phenomenon more pronounced in blacks than in any other race. Conclusion. It emerges from the above that physical anthropology thus has a method that is both powerful and fine, practicable whenever animal or human remains to be analyzed contain pieces of skin. This method is therefore also applicable to the protohistorical race of Egypt studied by Elliott Smith, who often collected pieces of skin. Perhaps the brown race of Sergi, which populated the entire Mediterranean basin in protohistory, and which is conveniently identified with the proto-dynastic Egyptian race, could also be re-examined? The power of the analytical method described above contrasts with its rare use. However, its finesse should not lead to the excesses of molecular anthropology, which would allow classifying two identical twins into different racial categories. Strictly speaking, the skin samples analyzed should have undergone identical treatment. A freshly collected skin, whether Negro or otherwise, should have first undergone a mummification process which, partially destroying the epidermis, would leave mainly the nuclei of the melanocytes in the form of inclusions in the separation tissues of the dermis and epidermis. Only in this case would melanin levels be rigorously comparable.